We've spent a fair amount of time talking about brain gut stuff, about Ayurveda stuff, and at this point what I'd really like to dive into is some of the practical applications of developing an Ayurvedic diet. So this video is really more about kind of like the foundations of the principles that we're going to use when we kind of think about how to put together the right diet for ourselves. Remember that the goal of what we're going to do here today is to really try to balance your Ayurvedic dosha. And we're not really 100% sure how this stuff works scientifically, but there is decent clinical evidence that when people start to implement these sorts of changes, they see definitive improvements in their mental health. So let's start with some of the basics. So remember that every person has something called a prakriti. We're going to go into a little bit more detail here, okay? So the prakriti is sort of your natural doshic balance. So if we talk about vata, pitta, and kapha, I, for example, have really high vata at baseline, I have kind of moderate pitta, and I have low kapha. And then furthermore, there's something called vikruti, which is sort of your adjusted dosha. And what that means is that based on our diet and environment and other factors like age, for example, our vata, pitta, and kapha, which mine sort of start out, let's say here, can actually adjust. So I try to do things that lower my vata. My pitta tends to stay pretty balanced, and if I'm lucky, I'll manage to increase my kapha. And so then what I end up with is a dosha that's here, here, and here. And if I stay in this range right here, I'll be healthier than if I sort of move in the opposite direction. So if we look at vikruti, unfortunately, a lot of people in society have elevated or deficient levels of dosha. So if we're thinking about someone who's prone to anxiety, they may start their vata over here, but then due to some environmental influences, they wind up over here. And for people who are suffering from depression, they may start with kapha over here and actually wind up down here. And then depending on your natural genetics, you may be more prone to depression or less prone to depression. And even in some cases, we'll have drastic changes in kapha that will actually lead to depression, or drastic changes in vata that will lead to anxiety. So now what we're going to look at is what are the general principles that we use to determine who should be eating what, okay? So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to start with vata over here, pitta over here, and kapha over here. And we're going to remind ourselves what are the qualities of each dosha. So vata is dry, cold, and light, right? Pitta is warm, wet, and kind of medium-bodied, neither dry nor heavy. Kapha is wet, cold, and heavy. And then if we pull on other videos and look at subtypes of depression or subtypes of anxiety, what we find is that there are sometimes combinations of things, right? So for example, depression has to do with a kapha imbalance, but then there are different kinds of depression. There's an anxious depression, which involves sort of a vata component to it, or there's actually a neuroscientifically different version of depression called depression with anger attacks, which is a pitta-oriented depression. So if someone has depression with anger attacks, these are the doshas that we want to fix. If someone has an anxious depression, these are the things that we want to fix. And then what we can do is look at, okay, so if I have an anxious depression, what are the common things between vata and kapha? And we find that that's cold, right? So where vata and kapha overlap is actually in cold. Where do pitta and kapha overlap? They actually overlap with wet. And then if we think about how do we want to balance this, so the main thing that we want to target if someone has an anxious depression is going to be to increase the warmth of our foods. And if someone has a kapha pitta problem, what we want to do is increase the dryness, right? Because what we essentially want to do is balance each of these qualities with the appropriate food. Now, some of y'all may say, well, okay, so sure, we want to balance things that are warm, but if I have a kapha imbalance and I have a vata imbalance, what do I do about the wetness and what do I want to do about the dryness? And this is where, remember that wet and dry are also a spectrum, right? So let's actually go to some specific examples. So here is what I would do if I was trying to balance each dosha, just as like kind of off-the-cuff recommendations. So remember that for vata kapha, vatas want really, really heavy foods, right? They want things like stews and oatmeal and stuff like that. The problem is that kaphas really want to steer clear of stuff like oatmeal. So while oatmeal is warm, it's a little bit too heavy, it's a little bit too sticky. So for a vata kapha, I would recommend something like a noodle soup. Right, so if we think about noodle soup, it's kind of like hearty, but it's also like most noodle soups tend to be clear. They tend to be a little bit lighter. They're still kind of hot and warm and can be heavily spiced, but they hopefully aren't too heavy. You can get some good kind of veggies in there and sort of maybe even get some meat or some protein in there. So a noodle soup is like a nice balanced meal for someone who's a vata kapha. Another thing that you can kind of think about is that you don't always have to have every meal be balanced for all of your doshas. And what we try to shoot for, and this is true of sort of Western dietary recommendations as well, we don't ask you to eat balanced meals. What we really want is a balanced diet. So on a particular meal like breakfast, you may go a little bit more vata heavy, and in other meals, like you may want to go a little bit more kapha heavy. So you can kind of balance things throughout the day. So let's look at a couple of other examples. So let's look at vata pittas. So if you've got like a vata pitta, person who's got anxiety, this is where I think about something like a nice pasta dish that isn't too heavy. So this is where you want some pasta, you want a little bit of body to it, you want a little bit of heaviness to it, maybe a slightly more creamy sauce, because some of that cream actually, the heaviness of the cream is good for the vatas. And the sort of, a lot of creams are based on dairy and things like that, which are really good for pittas. And so like a nice pasta with a creamy sauce, a couple of flash cooked vegetables could be really good for a vata pitta. And so let's kind of take a different tack. So let's take a look at breakfast, for example, okay? So what kind of breakfast do we want for each of our doshas? So for vatas, remember that we want things that are warm and wet. So the ideal breakfast for a vata is oatmeal. And I personally love to have oatmeal in the morning. Sometimes it's not my favorite thing to eat from a taste perspective, but what I really find is if I have oatmeal in the morning, it really helps me kind of stay even throughout the day. Vatas tend to be very, very sensitive to blood sugar fluctuations. So the nice thing about the high fiber oatmeal is that my body is sort of chewing away at it very slowly, takes a while to digest, and so I get a steady stream of glucose entering my bloodstream. And so let's take a look at kapha. So what's a good breakfast for a kapha? Remember that kaphas tend to be wet and cold and heavy, so we want something that's warm and dry and light. And so toast is a great example, so fresh toast, by the way, so we want it like warm right out of the toaster, is a great example of like a good breakfast for kaphas. And this too, I'd recommend something like a clear beverage. So either like tea or coffee that's not like too heavy. A clear warm beverage would be really good for kaphas first thing in the morning. Whereas vatas may want something a little bit heavier. So like I like a nice cup of masala chai in the morning, or something like an oat milk cappuccino, something that's a little bit heavier. And so, you can also kind of pick your beverage based on what your dosha is. And next, let's take a look at breakfast for pittas. So an ideal breakfast for pittas is actually granola and yogurt. And if we remember, pittas are warm and wet. So we want something that's a little bit drier, like granola, and a little bit cooling, like yogurt. And sure, yogurt is a little bit wet, but that's okay. I mean, it's not going to be 100%. And generally speaking, yogurt is very, very good for pittas. So pittas have a lot of fire to them, and so the cooling effect of the yogurt works really, really well. Interestingly enough, there are studies that show that people who are genetically pitta, and your genes, by the way, do map on very well to vata, pitta, and kapha. People who are genetically pitta are more prone to stomach ulcers. And there's actually data that shows that eating yogurts and probiotics are therapeutic and actually can help prevent stomach ulcers. So we're really living in a very exciting time scientifically because there are emerging studies that are really validating some of these principles of Ayurveda. So this is kind of a quick example of what we can think about in terms of breakfast. And so depending on your vikruti disturbance, you may have to develop sort of a modified diet plan that kind of changes a little bit over time. So the first thing that you want to do is kind of think a little bit, and we may have some resources for you here, about determining what your doshic balance is. And you don't have to fix everything at once. So if you have high vata, medium pitta, and low kapha, you can sort of target one dosha at a time, try to bring it in balance. You can also use some of our double dipping methods that we kind of talked about earlier, where you can find something that's sort of balanced towards two doshas at once. But you can kind of do it in piecemeal or kind of all at once. The other thing to remember is that doshic balance is sort of an ongoing thing. So there are some foods that you can start to eat to bring your doshas back in balance. But if you're not careful, your vikruti can get out of balance again. So you can eat the right sort of vata diet, but if you don't really control your routine, if you don't really control your technology usage, then your vata may continue to creep up. So overall, I hope that this has been a useful introduction into dietary principles of how to eat healthy in Ayurveda. We'll equip you guys with a lot more detailed resources. Like, for example, there are some kinds of foods or fruits or vegetables that are sort of ideal for each dosha. A good example of this is like vatas should avoid things like dried fruits because vatas don't have a very good digestive energy, and also those fruits tend to be very, very dried, whereas pittas can actually handle dry fruit really, really well. So we'll give you guys some more of this detailed guidance so that you can come up with a customized diet plan for yourself that aims to balance your doshas. What do I do about it, right? How do I actually leverage Ayurveda for the benefit of my mental health?
Pause. Does that mean? Oh, I'm so
Kevita.
so excited to get mad at people in those meetings.
We just talked about some notifications.